I spent my entire life saving for a quiet seaside cottage where I could finally find peace, but everything changed the moment my son called with shocking news. He announced that he and 25 of his in-laws would be arriving to stay in my home, turning my dream into a nightmare. What began as an innocent family visit quickly spiraled into chaos as they drained my money, took over my rooms, and treated me like a servant. Yet what they did not know was that I had a plan, and when the moment came, the family drama reached a turning point that none of them expected. This is a story of betrayal, courage, and the fight to reclaim dignity. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Now let us step into the beginning of this unforgettable story. For 72 years, Eleanor had carried the weight of duty. She had worked as a nurse through long nights and endless emergencies, putting the needs of others ahead of her own. When her husband passed away 5 years earlier, she felt the world grow unbearably heavy. Grief settled into her bones, but she kept moving, always caring for others, never once stopping to ask what she wanted. Now, with her savings carefully gathered over a lifetime, she had finally done something for herself. She bought a small seaside cottage on the edge of a quiet coastal town, a home where she could breathe rest and perhaps even rediscover the simple joys that life had stolen from her. The cottage was not grand, but to Eleanor it was perfect. Its walls were weathered by the ocean air, its windows open to the sound of crashing waves, and its little garden stretched down toward the rocky shore. When she walked through the front door for the first time, she inhaled the scent of salt and old wood and felt a rush of relief. Here at last was peace. She imagined mornings spent sipping coffee while watching the sunrise over the horizon. She pictured afternoons painting the seascape her brush, following the rhythm of the waves. At night, she could sit by the fireplace with a journal, listening to the sea whisper against the rocks. It felt fragile, almost too beautiful to believe. After a lifetime of sacrifice, was she truly allowed such peace? For several weeks, Eleanor lived as if in a dream. She tended the garden, planting herbs and flowers along the path to the beach. She dusted the old bookshelves and filled them with novels she had always wanted to read but never had the time for. She walked along the shore, collecting seashells and polished stones, arranging them carefully on her windowsills. Slowly, she began to heal. Her face softened, her shoulders relaxed, and she felt years of burden lifting. But beneath her calm, a shadow remained. Her son Marcus had not yet called. It was unusual, for he always seemed to call when he wanted something. She remembered all the times he had pressed her for money, insisting it was just a loan. She remembered how his wife Laura had once talked her into signing checks for supposed repairs that never took place. She remembered birthdays, missed conversations cut short, and the way both Marcus and Laura treated her grief after her husband's death as an inconvenience rather than a wound. Still, he was her only son, and she hoped that one day their relationship could heal as well. That hope would soon be tested in a way she never expected. One late afternoon, Eleanor sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the horizon fade into orange and violet. Her phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. She saw Marcus's name flash across the screen. Her heart quickened. She told herself to stay calm, to not let old fears rise. She answered. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice brisk and commanding, as if he were giving instructions to an employee. "Good news. We are coming to visit you this summer." Eleanor smiled faintly, unsure what to say. "That could be nice," she began, but Marcus continued before she could finish. "Not just me and Laura. We are bringing her whole family, 25 people. Kids, cousins, everyone. Your cottage is right on the coast. It is perfect. We will stay a few weeks. You can get the rooms ready. We will need food too, of course." The words sank like stones in Eleanor's chest. 25 people. In her small cottage for weeks, her savings had been enough to buy the home, but what little remained was meant to cover her modest living. She had no room, no supplies, no money to feed and house so many. "Marcus," she said carefully, her voice trembling, "that is far too many. I do not have the space. I do not have the means." "Come on, Mom," Marcus replied, irritation sharpening his tone. "You always say family comes first. This is what family does. Besides, you have that place all to yourself. It is selfish not to share it. Do not embarrass me in front of Laura's family. They are counting on you." Eleanor's hand shook as she held the phone. She felt herself shrinking back into the role she had played for years, the role of the accommodating mother who sacrificed without question. But something inside her resisted. This was her home, her one fragile dream of peace. Should she surrender it so quickly? She hesitated, and in that silence Marcus pressed harder. "We are already planning it. Everyone is excited. We will be there in 2 weeks. Just make sure things are ready." And then the line went dead. Eleanor lowered the phone slowly and stared out at the horizon. The sea that had seemed so gentle now roared louder in her ears. Her hands clenched around her teacup. 25 people were coming uninvited, expecting her to cook clean and provide as if she were running a hotel. She felt the walls of her dream tightening around her, the shadow of old exploitation creeping back into her life. She tried to breathe to calm herself, but the unease only grew stronger. She thought of Laura's sharp voice, the children running wild, the noise, the mess, the endless demands. She thought of Marcus's cold laughter, his casual disregard for her needs. Already she felt the weight of chains she thought she had broken when she bought this cottage. But Eleanor was not the same woman she once was. She had found a glimpse of freedom here, and she would not let it slip away without a fight. The question now burned inside her: would she endure another storm of exploitation, or would she finally stand against the tide? The days after Marcus's phone call passed in a blur of restless thoughts. Eleanor moved through her cottage, dusting shelves, folding linens, watering the garden, but her mind was elsewhere. Each task was haunted by the same image, the same impossible vision of 25 strangers crowding into her quiet seaside refuge. She told herself it could not truly happen, that Marcus might reconsider, that surely even he would see the madness of it. But in her heart she knew better. Marcus had never been one to ask, he demanded. And Laura encouraged him, feeding his sense of entitlement, treating Eleanor not as a mother, but as a servant to be used. Eleanor knew that when Marcus said something was decided, it was. He would not listen to her protests. He never had. On the morning of the second day, her phone buzzed again. A message from Marcus appeared, a list written as if she were an employee awaiting instructions. Get extra mattresses, paper towels, bottled water, meat for barbecues, snacks for the kids, wine for the adults, and beach chairs. Laura wants lobster one night, so find a place that sells fresh. Remember, no excuses. Eleanor read the message twice, her hands trembling. The list went on for nearly a page. She sat down heavily in her chair, staring at the words as if they were written in fire. How could he not see what he was doing? How could her son be so blind to the weight he placed on her shoulders? She set the phone down and pressed her palms to her eyes. Her savings were already thin after buying the cottage. She lived carefully, stretching each dollar, cooking, simply reusing what she had. To buy everything on Marcus's list would drain what little remained. That evening she walked along the shore, letting the tide lap at her feet as the sun dipped into the horizon. She tried to calm her mind, but the ocean no longer comforted her. It roared in her ears like the echo of the storm approaching. By the fourth day, a large delivery truck pulled up to her cottage. Eleanor stepped outside, confused. The driver called out delivery for Marcus Hale. Before she could answer, men began unloading crates of beer, soda, and packaged foods. When she protested that she had not ordered anything, the driver waved her off. Paid by card. Instructions said to leave it here. Eleanor's breath caught. Marcus had used her address without asking, and perhaps even her money. She rushed back inside to check her bank account. Her worst fear was confirmed. Several large withdrawals had been made in the last 2 days. The account balance that once gave her comfort now looked dangerously small. Her chest tightened as she sank into her chair. He had taken from her again, not even directly asking, just reaching in and helping himself. The betrayal stung sharper than any words could. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She sat by the dim glow of the fireplace, listening to the restless crash of waves outside. She thought back to the years of sacrifices she had made for Marcus, working double shifts to pay for his education. Selling her jewelry when he wanted to start a business that failed within months. Signing her name to checks she barely understood because Laura insisted they needed them. Every memory came back now, each one another thread in the web of exploitation that bound her. She had always told herself it was what mothers did, but now, alone in her cottage, she saw the truth more clearly. This was not love. This was control. The next morning, another message arrived. "We are coming next week. Expect us Saturday. Make sure there are enough beds and meals for everyone. Laura's parents want to fish, so arrange something for them. Do not forget, Mom. Everyone is counting on you." The casual cruelty of it twisted like a knife. Everyone is counting on you. The words were meant to guilt her, to trap her, to chain her once more to their endless demands. Eleanor set the phone down with shaking hands. She looked around her little cottage, her dream of peace, and she felt it slipping away. The rooms would soon be filled with noise and chaos. Her garden would be trampled, her bank account would be emptied. She would be pushed aside, treated as a servant in her own home. But a new thought stirred within her, quiet at first, then stronger. Did she have to allow it? For so long she had accepted Marcus's control, convincing herself it was love. But here in this cottage she had built something for herself. For the first time in decades she had chosen her own life. Could she give it up so easily? Eleanor stood and walked to the window. The sea stretched endlessly before her, wild and untamed. She thought of the generations of women in her family, of her mother, who had never spoken up against her father's demands, of her grandmother, who had lived her life bending to others' wills. Was she destined to repeat that pattern until her final breath? No, she whispered to herself. Not this time. Her heart pounded as she realized what she must do. If Marcus and Laura truly intended to bring their army of relatives, then she needed to be ready, not with beds and food, but with something stronger. She could not fight them with guilt or pleading. She needed facts, law, and protection. The decision frightened her. She had never stood so firmly against Marcus before. But as she looked out at the stormy waves, she felt a strange sense of resolve. She would not let her son strip her of her last chance at peace. For the first time in her life, Eleanor would fight back. Eleanor spent the next morning moving quietly through her cottage, folding linens and sweeping the floor, though there was little dust to be found. Her hands worked from habit, but her mind was far away. The sea outside whispered and roared, but it no longer soothed her. Each sound seemed to remind her of Marcus's words, his sharp voice pressing down like a weight. 25 people. Food, drinks, beds, entertainment. The list echoed in her head until it grew unbearable. She tried to steady her breath, but with each passing hour the same memories returned. She remembered the first time Marcus asked for money. He had been fresh out of college, full of dreams but careless. He called her one evening saying he needed a small loan to cover bills until his next paycheck. Eleanor had said yes without hesitation. What mother would not? She wired him the money and felt proud that she could help him. But weeks later he came again, and then again, until the requests were no longer occasional but constant. Her late husband had warned her once quietly that Marcus was taking advantage. She remembered that conversation vividly. They had been sitting at the kitchen table, her husband's hands folded, his face heavy with concern. "You cannot keep giving in," he had said. "He is learning to lean on you instead of standing on his own." Eleanor had bristled, then protective, defensive, unwilling to believe her son capable of selfishness. She told herself it was only temporary. But it was not temporary. After her husband passed, Marcus's requests grew larger, and Laura's voice began to accompany his. Eleanor could still hear Laura's bright tone laced with manipulation. "You are such a generous mother," she would say. "We do not know what we would do without you. Could you sign this check for us, just this once?" Eleanor, still grieving and aching, had nodded. She signed, believing she was helping them build a stable future. But the checks disappeared into vague repairs and failed projects. The jewelry her husband had given her on their 40th anniversary, a golden locket that carried their pictures, was sold at Laura's urging. "It is only sitting in a drawer," Laura had said lightly. "Better to turn it into cash for Marcus's business. Imagine how proud he will make you when it succeeds." The business collapsed within months, leaving nothing but debt and shame. The locket was gone forever. Eleanor's chest tightened as she walked into her small bedroom, looking at the few keepsakes she still possessed. A silver frame with her wedding photo. A seashell her husband once picked up during their only vacation by the coast. Each item carried weight, not because of value, but because it was hers. She had so little left that was not touched or taken by Marcus and Laura. She sat down on the edge of her bed, her eyes damp. Why had she allowed it all for so long? She thought of the nights after her husband's funeral when the house felt like a tomb. She had waited for Marcus to call, to offer comfort, to sit by her side even for a moment. Instead, when he finally arrived, it was with papers to sign. Insurance forms, financial documents, requests that she transfer part of her savings to him for safekeeping. She had been too broken to argue, too desperate for connection. She signed. And later, when she realized the money was gone, she said nothing. It felt easier to believe it was helping him than to admit she had been deceived. The memories piled higher, pressing against her chest. She saw Marcus laughing with friends in her old apartment, turning it into a party spot while she was left to clean afterward. She saw Laura arriving with shopping bags full of groceries bought with Eleanor's money, only to complain that the brands were not what she wanted. She saw her grandchildren running wild through her garden, breaking pots and pulling up plants while Laura scolded her for not child-proofing better. Each memory was a cut, small on its own, but together forming deep wounds. Eleanor realized she had been bleeding for years without ever stopping to tend to herself. She rose and walked to the window. Outside, the sea churned under heavy clouds. The horizon looked dark, the waves restless as if reflecting her own storm inside. Her thoughts turned again to Marcus's recent withdrawals from her bank account. He had taken without asking, without explanation, and she knew he would take more. She remembered overhearing him once years ago laughing with a friend on the phone. "Mom will sign anything if you sound serious enough," he had said. "She is easy like that." Those words had haunted her then, but she had buried them. Now they rose again, undeniable. He had not seen her as a mother to respect, but as a source to exploit. Eleanor pressed her hand against the glass, the cold seeping into her skin. For the first time, she let herself feel the anger fully. It was not only grief or fear anymore. It was indignation, hot and sharp, cutting through the years of silence. She had been used over and over, and it had cost her more than money. It had cost her dignity. But as the anger rose, so did something else. A quiet determination. She was no longer the grieving widow who signed papers blindly. She was a woman who had finally carved out a piece of freedom for herself, and she would not surrender it without a fight. She turned away from the window and walked to her desk. On it lay her phone, a pen, and a notepad. She sat down and began to write. Not a letter to Marcus, not yet, but a list of her own. A list of every time she had been taken advantage of, every item lost, every dollar stolen, every moment dismissed. The list grew longer than she expected. By the time she finished, the paper was nearly full. She read it over, her heart pounding, and felt something shift inside. The list was no longer just a record of her suffering. It was proof. Proof that she had been wronged, proof that she had endured, and proof that she had reason to stand up now. Eleanor folded the paper and tucked it into her journal. She knew she would need it soon. The sound of the waves grew louder, crashing against the shore as if warning her of what was to come. Marcus and his entourage were only days away. She could already imagine the noise, the chaos, the demands. But this time she would not meet them as the quiet mother who yielded. She would meet them as someone ready to fight. The question that lingered was how. She glanced at the phone again. Tomorrow she decided she would drive into town. She needed advice, and she knew she could not face this alone. As she blew out the lamp and settled into bed, her heart was still heavy, but her mind was sharper than it had been in years. For the first time, she was not simply waiting for Marcus to decide her life. She was preparing to decide it herself. The week passed like a clock counting down to disaster. Each day Eleanor woke with the same knot in her stomach, the same dread hanging over her. She tried to keep busy scrubbing the kitchen, dusting the shelves, trimming the plants in her garden, but it all felt hollow. The cottage that once brought her peace now seemed to tremble with anticipation of an oncoming storm. On Saturday morning the storm arrived. Eleanor was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the restless horizon when she heard it. The low rumble of engines, the screech of tires, voices carried on the wind. She stood slowly, her heart pounding, and watched as not one but several vehicles turned up her narrow driveway. Large vans, SUVs, even a pickup truck overflowing with coolers and beach toys pulled to a stop in front of her cottage. Doors swung open and people spilled out, men with sunglasses and booming voices, women carrying bags and children shouting as they raced across the yard. It looked less like a family gathering and more like an invading army. Before Eleanor could even step forward, Laura appeared, her heels clicking against the stones as she strode toward the porch. Her smile was sharp, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor's home as if appraising it. "Mom," Laura said, kissing the air beside Eleanor's cheek without actually touching her. "Finally, the famous seaside cottage. I told everyone it would be perfect. You really outdid yourself." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form words, Laura was already shouting over her shoulder, "Kids, grab any room you want, first come first served." A stampede followed. Children rushed inside, their shoes pounding against the wooden floors, their laughter echoing through the house. Eleanor stepped forward, but Marcus appeared, then slinging an arm around her shoulders. "Relax, Mom," he said with a grin that did not reach his eyes. "This is going to be great. Everyone's excited to spend time here. You'll love it." Eleanor tried to reply, but her words were drowned out by the chaos. Relatives carried boxes of food, crates of beer, and piles of luggage through the door. Someone dragged a beach umbrella across the living room, knocking over a lamp. Two boys wrestled on the sofa, kicking their shoes against the cushions. Within minutes, Eleanor's quiet home no longer felt like hers. It had been overrun, transformed into a noisy, cluttered campsite. She found herself shoved aside as Laura's parents claimed her bedroom without asking, tossing their bags onto her quilt and shutting the door. Eleanor stood in the hallway, stunned. She began, but the door clicked shut in her face. Laura appeared again, her smile sharp. "Oh, we'll need extra pillows and blankets. The attic should do for you, right? It's just temporary." Eleanor blinked. "The attic, yes," Laura said lightly, as if it were obvious. "The kids need space, and the adults need proper beds. You understand." Eleanor wanted to protest, but Marcus's voice cut in. "Come on, Mom, don't make this difficult. You always say family is important. Everyone's counting on you to make this work." The words struck like a chain around her neck. "Everyone's counting on you." The same phrase he had used in his message. She felt her throat tighten, but she swallowed the protest. For the moment she retreated. The day unfolded in a blur of demands. Relatives shouted orders as if she were staff in a resort. "Where's the wine, Mom?" Marcus called. "We need more towels, Mom," one of the cousins added. "When's dinner ready?" asked another. In the kitchen, Eleanor worked frantically, pulling together meals from what little she had prepared. She fried eggs, buttered bread, and tried to stretch her supplies, but complaints filled the air. "This is too plain," someone muttered. "Don't you have anything better?" Another grumbled. Her garden, once her pride, was trampled by children dragging toys across the soil, pulling up flowers as if they were weeds. A ceramic pot shattered against the stones, and no one bothered to apologize. Laughter filled the air, but it was laughter at her expense, careless and dismissive. By evening, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her body aching, her hands raw from work. Around her, the family lounged comfortably, plates, piled high drinks, flowing voices rising in careless joy. Not one offered to help with the dishes stacked in the sink. Not one thanked her for the food. Her heart sank as she looked around her own home and realized she no longer recognized it. The cottage was filled with noise and chaos, the air heavy with demands and entitlement. She felt like a stranger in her own sanctuary. Late that night, after the others had gone to bed, Eleanor climbed the narrow ladder to the attic, where a thin mattress had been spread on the floor. The air was stale, the ceiling low, and she had to stoop to avoid hitting her head. She sat on the mattress, her body trembling with exhaustion, and listened to the muffled voices and laughter drifting up from below. Her eyes burned with tears, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she clenched her fists. The anger she had felt in recent days returned stronger, now sharper. This was not a visit. This was a siege. They had come not as family, but as conquerors, and she had been cast aside in her own home. She lay back on the mattress, staring at the beams above her, and felt the weight of her decision pressing down. She could either endure this storm until it passed, sacrificing herself once more, or she could act. For years she had allowed Marcus and Laura to take from her, convincing herself it was love. But now, in the shadows of the attic, Eleanor realized something had changed. She was not the same woman anymore. She had found a glimpse of peace here, and she would not surrender it quietly. Tomorrow, she told herself, something must change. The first night in the attic left Eleanor restless and sore. The thin mattress gave her little comfort, and the air smelled of dust and mildew. Below, the house pulsed with noise, laughter, clattering dishes, the pounding of footsteps long past midnight. When at last silence fell, it was not peace but exhaustion that dragged her into sleep. By morning, she was already weary. She descended the ladder to find the kitchen in disarray. Plates smeared with grease crowded the counters, cups filled with stale soda sat on the table, and crumbs littered the floor. The refrigerator door hung open, revealing half-eaten trays of food and cartons left empty. Her stomach tightened at the sight. As she set about cleaning, voices rose around her. "Mom, where's the coffee?" Marcus called from the living room. "We need more eggs," Laura added sharply. "You barely made enough yesterday. Honestly, you should plan better." One of the cousins appeared at the doorway holding a pile of damp towels. "The bathroom's a mess. Can you deal with this?" Eleanor froze with her hands in the sink. The water ran over her wrists, hot and stinging, but it was not enough to drown out the words. She wanted to scream that this was not a hotel, that she was not their servant, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she nodded and carried on. The day unraveled in a blur of demands. Children ran wild, dragging sand through the house, shouting for snacks, spilling juice across the floor. Laura criticized every meal: too plain, too small, too late. Marcus barked orders as though he were managing a staff. The relatives lounged in the living room, their laughter filling the air, while Eleanor scrubbed, cooked, and carried until her body ached. That evening, she stood at the stove frying fish, while Laura leaned against the counter with a glass of wine. "You should really buy a bigger pan," Laura said, wrinkling her nose. "This one's too small for cooking properly. Maybe you can go into town tomorrow and get a better one." Eleanor gripped the handle tightly, her knuckles white. The cottage had been hers for barely a month, and already they spoke as if it belonged to them. When the meal was done, the family gathered at the table without so much as a thank you. Plates clattered, wine poured, voices rose. Eleanor sat quietly at the end, her own plate nearly empty. And then, as the laughter swelled, a boy knocked over his glass of juice, spilling it across the table. The liquid ran into Eleanor's lap. She jumped, startled, but before she could speak, Laura laughed. "Oh, don't worry. Mom will clean it," she said, waving her hand as if dismissing a maid. The laughter grew louder, but Eleanor did not join. She sat frozen, her lap soaked, her eyes burning. Something deep inside her cracked. All at once, the memories flooded back. The locket sold for nothing. The check signed in grief. The nights spent alone while Marcus and Laura took what they pleased. The attic mattress. The cold words. The laughter at her expense. Her hands trembled, but not with weakness. It was anger, hot, sharp, and long overdue. She pushed her chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor. The laughter faltered as heads turned toward her. Eleanor stood, her soaked skirt clinging to her, her eyes blazing. "I am not your servant," she said, her voice low but firm. The room fell silent. Laura blinked, then smirked. "Oh, come on, Eleanor. Don't be so dramatic. We're family." The words stung, but Eleanor did not waver. "Family does not treat me this way. Family does not take my money, steal my home, and laugh while I do all the work. You came here uninvited, and you act like I owe you. I owe you nothing." Marcus's expression hardened. "Mom, calm down. You're embarrassing yourself. Everyone's counting on you to make this trip work. Don't ruin it." Eleanor's heart pounded, but she did not sit back down. "No, you've taken enough. You've taken everything. I won't let you take this too." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. Then Laura laughed again, though the sound was strained. "You're just tired, that's all. Maybe get some rest." But Eleanor knew there would be no rest if she stayed silent. She excused herself, ignoring Marcus's glare, and retreated to the attic. That night, lying awake, the storm inside her grew. She had spoken yes, but words alone would not be enough. Marcus and Laura would not leave simply because she demanded it. They would push harder, guilt her deeper, and drain her further, unless she did something more. Her gaze drifted to the folded paper in her journal, the list she had written of every wrong, every theft, every wound. She thought of the lawyer in town, the bank clerk, the laws she had never dared to use in her defense. Tomorrow she decided she would no longer be alone. She would seek help, real help, the kind that Marcus could not twist with guilt or laughter. She closed her eyes, her fists clenched, her resolve hardening with every crash of the waves against the shore. The breaking point had come and she had crossed it. The question now was not whether she would fight, but how far she was willing to go. The morning sun crept through the attic window, casting a pale light over the beams above Eleanor's head. She had barely slept. Her body ached from the hard mattress, her mind churned with restless thoughts, and her heart beat with a new rhythm, fury sharpened into resolve. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the others. The house was still, the air thick, with the smell of spilled wine and stale food. She moved silently down the ladder, avoiding the squeaky step, and slipped out the front door with her purse tucked tightly under her arm. The ocean breeze met her face as she walked to her car. For the first time in days, she breathed deeply. Today she would not cook, clean, or bend. Today she would seek something she had denied herself for too long: justice. The drive into town felt longer than usual. Every turn of the road seemed to echo her thoughts. She remembered Marcus's voice, Laura's smirk, the laughter that followed every demand. They thought she was helpless, too weak to resist, too loyal to rebel, but they did not know what she was about to do. She parked near the town square and stepped onto the cobblestone street. The lawyer's office was tucked between a bakery and a bookshop, its brass sign dulled by salt air. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door, but she pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. A young secretary looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "No, but I need help. Please. It's urgent." Moments later, she was led into a modest office, lined with shelves of thick legal volumes. Behind the desk sat Mr. Harding, a middle-aged lawyer with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. He gestured for her to sit. "How can I help you, Mrs. Hale?" Eleanor said softly. "Eleanor Hale." She hesitated then. The words spilled out. She told him everything: Marcus's demands, the 25 relatives, the forced invasion of her home. She spoke of the withdrawals from her bank account, the jewelry sold, the endless guilt that bound her. Her voice trembled at times, but once she began, she could not stop. Years of silence poured out in a single torrent. Mr. Harding listened without interruption, his pen moving across the page. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the ticking of a clock. "You are describing elder abuse, Mrs. Hale," he said finally. "Financial exploitation, coercion, and emotional manipulation. You have more rights than they would like you to believe." Eleanor's throat tightened. "But he is my son." Mr. Harding's expression softened. "Family does not excuse abuse. The law protects you. You own your home. They have no right to occupy it without your consent. You also have the right to set terms of lodging or to remove them entirely. If money has been taken from your accounts without permission, that is theft." The word struck her like a blow. Theft. She had thought it, but hearing it aloud gave it weight. Mr. Harding slid a paper across the desk. "Here is what I suggest. Draft a written agreement, setting clear terms, lodging rates, food costs, repayment for damages. Present it to them. If they refuse, you are within your rights to demand they leave. And if they resist you, call the authorities. Do not be afraid to stand on the law." Eleanor stared at the paper. Her hands shook as she touched the pen. For years she had signed papers that drained her, that stole from her, that silenced her. But now for the first time she was signing something to protect herself. When she left the office, the sun felt brighter, the air lighter. She walked down the street with her chin lifted. Her next stop was the bank. The clerk, a woman about her age named Janice, greeted her warmly. Eleanor explained her concerns, her suspicion that Marcus had been tampering with her account. Janice frowned as she checked the records. "Mrs. Hale, there were attempts to change your account's contact information last week, requests to add an additional name. We flagged it because it seemed unusual." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Was it my son Janice?" Hesitated, then nodded. The request was made in his name. Eleanor gripped the counter, her pulse racing. He had not only taken money, he had tried to seize control of everything she had left. Janice placed a hand on hers. "We can secure your accounts. Add extra verification, block any outside access. Only you will be able to authorize changes." But you must be careful. If someone pressures you, come straight to us." Eleanor nodded, her eyes wet with both shame and relief. "Thank you," she whispered. By the time she drove back toward the cottage, the tide had risen, the waves striking harder against the rocks. But she did not hear them as threats anymore. They sounded like strength, like defiance. She parked quietly and sat for a moment in the car. From inside the house, she could hear laughter, the clinking of glasses, the careless noise of people who believed they owned her home. Her hands clenched around the steering wheel. Not anymore, she thought. She stepped out and walked toward the cottage with the papers tucked safely in her bag. Every step felt heavy but also certain. She knew Marcus would resist Laura, would sneer the relatives, would protest, but she was no longer afraid of their voices. She had the law, the bank, and her own resolve. Inside, the chaos had not lessened. A radio blared in the living room, children shouted from the garden, and Laura barked orders in the kitchen. Marcus appeared when Eleanor opened the door, his smile sharp. "There you are, Mom. We were wondering where you went. Did you get everything we asked for?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. For the first time in years, she did not flinch. She held her bag, closed the papers within like a shield. "I was taking care of something important," she said quietly. Marcus frowned, but before he could press further, Eleanor walked past him toward her room. She would wait until the right moment. When the time came, she would lay the papers before them and watch their empire of entitlement tremble. The waves crashed against the shore outside, loud and unyielding. The day crept by in a haze of noise. Eleanor kept to herself, her bag with the papers never leaving her side. From the attic window, she watched the tide climb higher, the sky shifting from blue to the burnt orange of evening. Her heart pounded with every crash of the waves. Tonight, she told herself, tonight it ends. Downstairs, the family prepared for another feast. The smell of meat grilling outside mixed with the salty air. Laughter spilled through the rooms, careless and loud, as though the cottage were a vacation lodge they had booked and paid for. Marcus's voice rose above the rest, barking orders about drinks and plates, Laura chiming in with complaints about spices and side dishes. Eleanor listened, her hands trembling as she held the papers Mr. Harding had drafted. When the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the floorboards, she descended from the attic. Her steps were steady, though her chest felt tight. She entered the living room where most of the family had gathered, plates balanced on their laps, the television humming in the background. Marcus looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and impatience. "Mom," he said as if speaking to a servant. "Finally. We need more napkins. And grab another bottle of wine from the pantry." Eleanor did not move toward the kitchen. Instead, she stepped into the center of the room. The laughter faded slowly as relatives noticed the papers in her hand, her rigid stance, the fire in her eyes. "I need everyone's attention," she said. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying across the room. A hush fell. Marcus chuckled, setting his plate aside. "What is this?" "Some kind of announcement." Eleanor held the papers higher. "Yes, this is an announcement. Starting tonight, this house is no longer free to you. If you wish to stay, you will do so under these terms." Confusion flickered across faces. Laura smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Terms? What on earth are you talking about, Eleanor?" Eleanor unfolded the first page. Her hands no longer shook. "Lodging fees per person per night. Meal costs per plate. Payment for utilities and damages. If you refuse to pay, you will leave this house immediately." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then the room erupted. Voices rose all at once. Some scoffed, others shouted, children whined. Laura's laughter cut through them all. "You cannot be serious. Charging your own family. Have you lost your mind?" Marcus's face darkened. He stood looming over Eleanor. "Mom, stop this nonsense. You're embarrassing yourself. Put that paper away." But Eleanor did not flinch. She looked directly into his eyes. "No, Marcus. The embarrassment is yours. You brought 25 people into my home without asking, drained my money, and treated me like staff. This ends now." Gasps rippled through the room. Marcus stepped closer, his jaw tight. "You're too old to live alone, Mom. You need us. Do you really want to push away the only family you have?" The words cut, but Eleanor held her ground. "Family doesn't steal from me. Family doesn't laugh while I suffer. You don't want me, Marcus. You want what I have, but it's mine, and I will not give it to you. Laura rose, then her voice sharp with mockery. Listen to her. She thinks she can throw us out. She doesn't understand. She needs us. Without us, she'll rot in this little shack. The room stirred with uneasy murmurs, but Eleanor raised her voice. No, without you I will finally live. The words echoed like thunder. For a moment the family stared at her in stunned silence. Then from the doorway another voice rang out. She's right. All heads turned. Mrs. Delgado, Eleanor's neighbor, stood there with a basket of fish in her arms. She had stepped in quietly unnoticed in the chaos. Her eyes were sharp, her presence commanding. I came to drop this off, she said, setting the basket down. But what I see here is shameful. 25 people eating, drinking, and lounging while one woman slaves away. You call that family? Laura flushed, stammering. This is none of your. It is everyone's business when you exploit the elderly. Mrs. Delgado snapped. She turned to Eleanor. You don't need to take this. The whole town knows you. If you call for help, you'll have it. The power shifted in that moment. Eleanor felt it. Marcus's glare faltered. Laura's smirk wavered. The relatives shifted uncomfortably. For once they saw they could not hide behind family ties. Their cruelty had been exposed. Marcus tried one last tactic. He crossed his arms, sneering. Fine. If you want money so badly, we'll give you something. 200. That's more than enough for what little you've done. Eleanor lifted the papers again. The rates are clear. Pay them or leave tonight. Those are the only options. The room buzzed with angry voices, but none dared step closer. Marcus's fists clenched, but he said nothing more. Eleanor's heart raced, but she stood tall, her eyes never leaving his. For the first time in her life, she was not pleading. She was not begging. She was commanding. And as dusk deepened, shadows filling the corners of the room, she knew the battle was no longer about beds or meals. It was about dignity. Hers. The cottage felt like it was holding its breath. Eleanor stood firm in the center of the living room, the legal papers in her hands, trembling only slightly now. Around her, the family buzzed with whispers and protests, their voices rising and falling like angry waves. Marcus loomed close, his glare sharp, while Laura crossed her arms and rolled her eyes. Then at the doorway, Mrs. Delgado placed her basket of fish on the table with a deliberate thud. The sound cut through the noise. Everyone turned toward her. I've lived next door for 10 years, she said, her voice steady, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the room. I've seen a lot, but this is disgraceful, Laura scoffed. Excuse me, but this is family business. Mrs. Delgado's sharp gaze pinned her in place. Family business. Family doesn't storm into a woman's home, eat her food, take her bed, and treat her like staff. Family doesn't drain her bank account behind her back. Don't you dare call this family. A hush fell. Even the children, sensing the tension, grew quiet. Marcus stepped forward, his voice low and tight. You don't know what you're talking about. My mother is fine. She wants us here. Eleanor lifted the papers again. No, Marcus. I don't. The weight of her words filled the room. Marcus faltered, his jaw tightening. Mrs. Delgado folded her arms. If you don't like her terms, then you can pack your things and go. The law will be on her side, not yours. Some of the relatives exchanged uneasy glances. One of Laura's cousins whispered something about finding a hotel. A younger woman muttered, This isn't what we signed up for. Laura snapped at them. Don't be ridiculous. We're not leaving. She's bluffing. But Eleanor's voice cut cleanly through the air. I am not bluffing. This is my home. You pay or you leave. Tonight. The words hung heavy. Marcus clenched his fists, his face red with anger. But Mrs. Delgado stepped closer, her presence like a shield beside Eleanor. Try to force her, she said coldly, and you'll answer to the police. And the town. Do you really want that reputation? For the first time, Marcus hesitated. He glanced at the others, expecting support, but instead he saw doubt. His control, once so effortless, was crumbling. Laura tried to recover. $200. That's what we'll give you. That's more than generous. Eleanor shook her head. 200 wouldn't cover one night for all of you. I'm done being generous. Either follow the rates in the contract or get out. Angry murmurs rippled through the room. Some relatives argued among themselves, others stared at the floor. A boy kicked at the leg of a chair, sulking. The once boisterous group now looked fractured, divided by the weight of Eleanor's words and Mrs. Delgado's fierce support. Finally, one of Laura's uncles stood shaking his head. "I didn't come here to fight. We'll go. I'd rather sleep in a motel than be part of this mess." Aunt after aunt, cousin after cousin followed, some muttering complaints, others avoiding Eleanor's eyes. Bags were gathered, coolers dragged toward the door. The children whined but obeyed as their parents pulled them along. Laura's voice grew shrill as she tried to stop them. "What are you doing? She's bluffing. She can't survive without us." But no one listened. The power had shifted and everyone knew it. Marcus was the last to remain, his face twisted with fury. "You've ruined everything," he spat at Eleanor. "Do you know what people will say? That you turned on your own son? You'll be alone until the day you die." Eleanor's chest ached at the words, but she stood taller. "Better to be alone than surrounded by those who treat me like nothing. I will not live in chains anymore, Marcus. Not for you, not for anyone." "Mrs. Delgado stepped closer, her voice cool. "You heard her. Leave." For a long moment, Marcus's glare lingered. Then, with a growl, he grabbed his bag and stormed out the door. Laura followed, hurling one last bitter look at Eleanor before slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was overwhelming. For the first time in days, the cottage was still. Eleanor's hands shook as she lowered the papers. Her knees felt weak, but she did not fall. Mrs. Delgado touched her arm gently. "You did it," she said softly. "You stood up to them." Eleanor let out a breath she had been holding for years. "I thought I never could," she whispered. Mrs. Delgado smiled, though her eyes glistened. "You're stronger than you know." Together they began to tidy the wreckage, left behind dirty plates, spilled drinks, broken trinkets. It would take time to restore the cottage, but the air already felt lighter, freer. For the first time since buying her home, Eleanor felt it was truly hers. That night she returned to her own bed. The sheets smelled of lavender, her quilt warm against her skin. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the waves. They no longer sounded like threats. They sounded like promises. And yet deep inside, she knew the storm wasn't fully over. Marcus would not give up so easily. He had taken from her all his life. He would try again. But now Eleanor was ready. She had allies, she had strength, and most importantly, she had herself. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would begin rebuilding not only her home, but her life. The next morning, sunlight poured through the cottage windows. For the first time since the invasion, Eleanor woke in her own bed. The silence was almost startling. No footsteps pounding down the hall, no voices shouting for food, no demands echoing through the rooms. Just the soft rhythm of waves outside and the call of seabirds drifting on the air. She sat up slowly, savoring the peace. For years she had thought herself powerless, trapped beneath Marcus's demands and Laura's schemes. Yet here she was alone, free and stronger than she had ever imagined. Downstairs, the house bore scars of the siege. Empty bottles lined the counter, crumbs covered the table. The garden outside lay trampled and broken. But the mess felt different now. It was not a weight pressing down on her. It was proof that they were gone. Mrs. Delgado came by mid-morning with a broom in hand and determination in her eyes. Together they began the long process of restoring the cottage. They swept the floors, scrubbed the counters, and set broken things aside for repair. Each task felt like reclaiming a piece of Eleanor's life. By noon the rooms looked brighter. Sunlight streamed across freshly cleaned windows and the salty air flowed freely again. Eleanor paused, wiping her hands on a towel, and felt a swell of pride. "You're stronger than they ever expected," Mrs. Delgado said with a small smile. "They thought they had you trapped, but you showed them." Eleanor nodded, though her chest tightened. "Marcus won't forgive me. He'll come back. He always does." Mrs. Delgado set a hand on her shoulder. "Then you'll be ready. You've got the law on your side and you've got friends. He can't control you anymore." That night, Eleanor sat at her desk with her journal open. She unfolded the paper she had written days ago, the long list of every wound, every theft, every time she had been silenced. She read it slowly, her eyes tracing each memory. For the first time, the list didn't feel like a record of defeat. It felt like a declaration of survival. She added one final line: "I chose myself." The next days passed in quiet rhythm. Eleanor replanted her garden, pressing her fingers into the soil with care. She painted the coastline at sunrise, the canvas filled with colors that spoke of resilience. She met neighbors in town, joining them for coffee and laughter. With every step, she felt the chains of the past loosening. But Marcus did return. It was late afternoon when her phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. Eleanor's heart tightened, but she steadied her breath and answered. "You've made a fool of me," Marcus said without greeting. His voice was sharp, his anger simmering. "Laura's family is furious." "Do you know what you've done?" Eleanor kept her voice calm. "I protected myself. You humiliated me," he snapped. "After everything I've done for you," her anger sparked. "Everything you've done, you've stolen from me, Marcus. You've used me, drained me, and laughed about it. That ends now." He tried again, his tone shifting. "You can't live alone forever, Mom. You'll need us. You'll regret pushing us away." Eleanor closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the waves outside her window. "I'd rather live alone with dignity than surrounded by people who treat me like nothing. Don't call me unless you're ready to treat me with respect." Before he could reply, she ended the call. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down, but she felt no guilt. Instead, a quiet strength filled her chest. For the first time, she had spoken to Marcus not as a frightened mother, but as a woman who knew her worth. In the days that followed, he called again, each time trying a different tactic: anger, guilt, false sweetness. Eleanor answered only once more, repeating the same boundary. After that, she let the phone ring unanswered. Slowly, the calls grew less frequent. Laura tried too, leaving messages laced with bitterness and manipulation. "You've destroyed this family," she sneered in one voicemail. "No one will stand by you when you're old and frail." Eleanor listened once, then deleted the message. She would not carry their poison any longer. With each refusal, she felt lighter. Marcus and Laura's control, once so suffocating, collapsed like a house built on sand. One evening, Mrs. Delgado joined her on the porch. They sat together, watching the sun sink into the sea, the horizon glowing gold and crimson. "You know," Mrs. Delgado said, "people in town are talking. They're proud of you. They say it takes courage to stand up to your own blood." Eleanor smiled faintly. "For so long I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought being a good mother meant giving until there was nothing left. But love without respect isn't love. It's chains." Mrs. Delgado nodded. "And you broke them." As darkness fell, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in years: freedom. She had chosen herself. She had reclaimed her dignity. And she knew now that no matter how many times Marcus or Laura tried to return, they would never again control her. Yet deep in her heart, she also knew this was not only her story. How many others were out there, bound by guilt, silenced by fear, believing love meant surrender? She vowed that her voice would not be silent anymore. The waves crashed in steady rhythm, as if echoing her resolve. The summer sun lingered long on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Eleanor sat on the porch of her seaside cottage, a cup of tea in her hand and a blanket draped lightly across her knees. The waves rolled steadily against the shore, calm now, no longer echoing the storm of voices that had once filled her home. Her garden had begun to recover. Where children's feet had trampled flowers, new shoots pushed through the soil, stubborn and alive. The air smelled faintly of salt and rosemary. In the quiet, she felt something she had not felt in years, peace that was not fragile but earned. It had been weeks since Marcus and Laura stormed away with their relatives. At first, Eleanor had braced herself for their return, expecting the phone to ring with more demands. But the calls grew fewer, and each time she stood firm, her refusals short and steady. Slowly, their control dissolved into silence. She did not grieve the silence. She welcomed it. Mrs. Delgado visited often, bringing bread from the bakery or fish from the market. Together they laughed in the kitchen, their voices filling the cottage with warmth instead of tension. Eleanor joined her for walks into town, where neighbors greeted her kindly, some even praising her courage for standing up against her own family. At first, the attention embarrassed her, but then she realized it was not shame they saw, it was strength. She began to take painting classes at the community center. With brush in hand, she captured the sea at dawn, the garden in bloom, the cliffs where gulls wheeled in the sky. Each canvas told a piece of her story, not of loss but of reclamation. She found joy in simple routines, watering plants, brewing tea, writing in her journal. Every small act felt like a declaration: this is my life, and I will live it on my terms. Yet the memories of Marcus lingered, sometimes sharp as broken glass. She would think of the locket sold, the checks signed in grief, the laughter that cut like a blade. For a time she wondered if she had failed as a mother, if his cruelty was somehow her fault. But the more she reflected, the more she saw the truth. She had given love freely, but love alone cannot cure greed. She had sacrificed, but sacrifice does not excuse betrayal. One evening, as the tide pulled low, Eleanor sat with Mrs. Delgado on the porch. They watched the horizon glow with the last light of day. "Do you ever regret it?" Mrs. Delgado asked softly. Eleanor sipped her tea. "I regret not standing up sooner. I regret letting them take so much before I said enough. But do I regret what I did now? No. For the first time I feel whole. I feel free." Mrs. Delgado nodded. "Then you've won." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Yes, but the victory is not only mine. It belongs to anyone who chooses to break free from chains, no matter who forged them." That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal again. She did not write a list of losses this time. Instead, she wrote a list of hopes. To travel to the mountains in autumn, to paint the cliffs in every season, to invite neighbors for tea, to wake each morning and feel the ocean breeze without fear of who might come to take it away. Each word was a seed planted in her heart. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Eleanor's cottage grew into a true sanctuary. Friends came and went, bringing laughter and kindness. The garden thrived, the flowers blooming brighter than before. The walls, once echoing with chaos, now held peace. Marcus's voice faded into the past. Perhaps one day he would call again. Perhaps he would try to mend what he had broken. But Eleanor knew one thing, with certainty. She would never again surrender her dignity for the sake of keeping the peace. Her story was no longer about what had been taken from her. It was about what she had reclaimed. Standing at the edge of the shore one crisp morning, the wind whipping her hair, Eleanor whispered to the sea, "I am free." The waves answered with their steady rhythm, strong and unyielding like her own heart. The cottage stood quiet as autumn winds swept across the coastline. Leaves rustled along the garden path, and the sea shifted into deeper shades of gray and blue. Eleanor sat on her porch, a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her journal resting open on her lap. She had filled its pages with memories, reflections, and lessons she once thought she was too old to learn. But now, as the waves rose and fell before her, she understood that it was never too late to begin again. She had faced betrayal, endured humiliation, and wrestled with the cruel realization that her own son saw her not as a mother, but as a resource to exploit. The pain of that truth still cut deep. Yet from that pain had grown something unexpected: strength. A strength she never believed she could summon. The memory of that night lingered in her mind, the crowded room, the papers in her hands, the look of shock when she finally said no. It had not been easy. Her heart had nearly given out from fear, her knees had trembled, but she had stood her ground. She had broken a cycle that stretched back through her life, and perhaps even through the lives of the women who came before her. Eleanor turned a page in her journal and began to write. Love without respect is not love. Sacrifice without gratitude is not kindness. To give endlessly without boundaries is not virtue, it is surrender. I will no longer surrender. The words looked stark against the paper, but they rang with truth. She thought of her mother, a quiet woman who had lived her life bowing to the demands of others. Eleanor remembered the way her grandmother had endured silently, her voice always hushed her, desires always buried. They had taught her that a good woman gave everything, expected nothing, and carried the weight of others without complaint. Eleanor had followed that lesson for most of her life. But now, sitting in her seaside cottage, she realized it was not a lesson of love but of loss. Her lesson would be different. When neighbors stopped by, she spoke of boundaries with quiet conviction. When friends at the community center asked about her summer, she told her story not with shame but with purpose. She wanted others to know they were not alone, that saying no was not cruelty but courage. Slowly, she saw the truth of her journey ripple outward, touching those who heard it. One afternoon, a younger woman in her painting class lingered after the others left. "My brother keeps asking me for money," she confessed softly. "I thought I had to say yes because he's family. But maybe I don't." Eleanor placed a hand on hers. "You don't. Love isn't measured by how much you allow yourself to be used. You are allowed to protect yourself." The woman's eyes shone with relief, and Eleanor felt a quiet pride. Her pain had become more than survival. It had become a message. As the weeks passed, the sea grew colder, storms sweeping the shore, but Eleanor no longer feared them. She saw in the waves a reflection of her own journey, turbulent, relentless, but always moving forward. She had weathered her storm. She had found her calm. One evening, as she watched the tide pull low, she whispered into the wind, "I am not broken. I am free." The words did not need an answer. The silence itself was enough. Eleanor's story is not just her own. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt silence taken for granted or bound by guilt in the name of love. It reminds us that family without respect can become chains. And it teaches us that dignity is not selfish, it is survival. Perhaps you too have faced voices that demanded more than they gave, hands that took without gratitude, or hearts that mistook your kindness for weakness. If so, Eleanor's lesson is for you. It is never too late to stand, never too late to say no, never too late to choose yourself. Remember, love without respect is not love. True family uplifts, it does not exploit. And freedom is not given, it is claimed. If Eleanor's journey touched you, I invite you to reflect on your own story. Share your thoughts in the comments because your voice may help someone else find their strength. And if you believe dignity is worth defending, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us in spreading stories that remind the world of this truth. Respect is the foundation of every bond worth keeping. Eleanor found her freedom. Now perhaps it is time for you to find yours.